projector ground to a halt as some of the footage snared in the spindles. I finally tore my eyes from the little square of light on the floor to finally realize that I was no longer alone. But the figure reaching the last step of the staircase, with eyes boring into my own, the figure holding a gruesome yellow bone shard, organs barely kept in as bite marks split her lengthwise. Despite the way her legs walked as if inverted, bones squelching through skin with the weight, I knew the face. Haze? I slowly stood up. Haze, you're in a pattern. The gash lines on her neck widened, head rolling back on itself. Her dead eyes stared at the ceiling, yet she continued forward all the same. Haze, listen to me. I hissed, pulse rapidly increasing. The kitchen door creaked as knives clattered onto the lobby floor. Ghoulish eyes began to peer from every dark corner. Look around you. None of this is real, Haze. I felt sickness rising in my throat. That's what the patterns are, what it's been all along. It's a hive mind, the dog. You have to wake up. She threw her hand out. I nearly dropped the projector as I threw my left arm up in horror. The bone split through my wrist, the force slamming my entire arm into my forehead. I felt the bone gash at my head like a burning iron, Haze distorting with speed as she tore across the carpet faster than humanly possible. She pivoted, arcing her foot at my skull to pile drive the shard further in. I dodged at the last second, only to watch her use the same momentum from the kick to hurl a piece of shattered railing without missing a beat. Blood speckled my face as the spine split through my open palm, being immediately driven into my shoulder as her second kick didn't miss. I spun backwards as Haze slashed across the ground, a far larger wooden stake in her hand. She stabbed at the projector spindles. Finally, I was able to hold my ground just enough to hack the canister to intercept her stab. The wood shattered against the metal shell, Haze flinching back as her skin sizzled against it. I frantically yanked the projector away, rolling against the base of the stairs and breathing heavy. The railing shard was still jutting out of my palm, making it hard to hold the canister. A stomach-churning smile ruptured across Haze's face like an open sore as she clambered up the railing like a spider. A howl split through the manor, a black mass rapidly slinking down from a dark hallway to stand at the top of the stairs, as several more cadavers staggered beside it. It winced at the footage still fluttering in the spindles. Haze, listen to me. I gripped the canister harder, looking between her and the dog. You'll rot here. The dog's fur bristled, lowering on its haunches as Haze's burned skin molted away and her fingers peeled back another sharp sliver of wood. The dog made no advancements, the corpses surrounding it slowly stepping forward in its place. Come on, I pleaded, beginning to back up towards the kitchen. Haze, if you forget everything, remember this. You can be conscious without break. Haze darted forward the minute my foot lifted off the ground. The dog's teeth were the only thing visible through the distorted mirage enveloping it, jowls peeling back in an inhuman smile to match Haze's. I again frantically put the canister in front of my face to parry the strike away, the metal clanking resounding through the manor. She hacked again and again, my own speed just barely able to match hers. Several more venomous exchanges occurred before the shard finally clattered from her hand, her advance not slowing. Sorry, I winced, reeling back the canister before swinging it with all my strength at her head. Forgive me for... Snap! The canister dented as she spun to kick it into the far wall. It ricocheted several times against the staircase before rolling off into the surrounding blackness. My eyes went wide, the skin of Haze's bare foot sizzling as she continued calmly walking. She slammed her own arm against the railing, bones snapping to form grisly jutting spikes as her amputated hand slopped to the floor. Fuck me! I gagged, spinning around only to see a ghastly thing standing in the kitchen doorway, arms draped with kitchen knives. "No time, Aunt Cheryl," I cringed, finally peeling the shard from my palm and immediately hurling it so hard I nearly lost my balance. And for the record, she stayed a lot longer than 2 nights. The carcass staggered back, arms snapping open with splaying tendons as the steak cleaved into its pale flesh, entirely missing its mark but still buying me enough time to slip past it and slam the door behind me. The damp, dark kitchen was coated in dead mold, snow still drifting from the massive hole where the window once was. Shattered glass decorated the floor, wood shrapnel scuttling in the wind. I wasn't going out that way, though. I frantically searched the floor for where I vaguely remembered dropping my gloves. The dog no longer appeared shy without fear of seeing the footage, the door behind me buckling with a spray of splinters as it howled. Scuffling rapidly came from the ceiling as several somethings crawled overhead. I set down the projector and dropped to my hands and knees, growing more frantic as the floor was far too dirty to make out much of anything. My eyes flashed back to the window before my breathing grew more labored. As much as I wanted to, I wasn't even sure running was an option. The way the mouse had died the minute the creature was taken out of the enclosure. There was a good chance whatever influence that black dog had was the only thing keeping me alive. The ceiling boards began to be torn away by splinter-ridden hands, finally fracturing, as an all-too-familiar set of dead gray eyes ignited in the darkness. Haze dropped from the ceiling upside down, landing with a broken snap of bones. I finally found what I had been looking for, grabbing up the projector and kicking the floor hard enough to feel my foot bruise. Haze's eyes scurried along the floor before snapping upwards to meet mine. Her legs bent unnaturally to bring her to her feet. One more kick left the floor to crack with a puff of foul air erupting from beneath. The latch cracked against the side of the shaft, a single, long ladder leading down into utter darkness. Haze bristled, backing away as if being physically burned, and in a fraction of a second, everything again went cold. I heard nails grate on wood, the door falling into silence, though I could still see fur beyond the shattered frame, breathing in and out. The other sounds from the ceiling also hastily snuffed out. Haze held absolutely still, eyes now trained directly on the basement. Her pupils were so small, I wasn't sure she could see at all. I slowly found words, trying to assess whether or not I could lower myself down before anything could act. I barely had enough air to force out anything at first, my voice shaky and weak. "You," I slowly continued, testing if Haze would look at me. "You remember this, don't you?" Haze's dead eyes remained fixed, skin flashing further pale as a horrific stench began to waft up from within the depths of the basement. I think I get it now," I continued slowly, my heart shuddering against my ribs as I forced my sneaker forward one step. I watched both Haze and the creature outside the door in my peripheries, seeing them both flinch at this, at the exact same time. Too far. Haze's eyes narrowed, the door again shuddering with a massive impact as the creature's claws raked at the hinges, peeling them back. Several more hands reached down from the ceiling, dead eyes glancing toward me. That's when I made a bad decision. I took a deep breath, feet planting as I watched Haze dart forward, slashing at my temple. I put up my hand slowly, wincing as the bloody bone split through my palm inches from my skull. Haze's eyes widened, my hand wrenching her closer as my fingers grabbed around her wrist. Sorry, I again cringed, wrenching her sideways with me until her staggering steps reached the edge of the hatch. Her feet slipped, neck snapping against the corner as I let the blood slip our hands apart, and she tumbled over the edge. The dog immediately let out a pained howl as it finally slammed what was left of the door against the tiles, a newfound desperation in its movements. I scrambled into the hatch, watching teeth blur toward me, just barely slamming the metal door closed overhead. Metal grated as I frantically turned the lock until the deadbolt groaned in protest. I hastily made my way down the ladder, one hand nearly slipping on Haze's blood as my other cradled the projector close to my chest. Frantic sounds continued to ring out overhead, massive weight being pressed against the hatch. Finally landing in the dusty basement, my senses were assaulted by the full-force stench of foul decomposition. The air seemed to buzz with sickness prying its way beneath my skin. My feet splashed in a puddle of blood, but Haze was nowhere to be seen. I reached up to find a light, the first cord I found snapping from the ceiling the minute I pulled it down. I fumbled for another, finally getting a minuscule spark of yellow light from a bulb that looked far too old to function. I whirled into the darkness but could barely see 2 feet in any direction. I cursed, frantically turning back around to miraculously find a tattered flashlight amidst a cluttered desk in front of me. I snatched it up while simultaneously uttering a prayer that it would work. I flipped the switch, watching faint white light crawl from beneath the glass. I immediately turned back into the darkness. The light landed on a shape huddled at the other end of the room, shivering. Haze was curled in a tight ball, eyes transfixed on some distant point. I swept the flashlight to see where she was looking. Tarnished, old metal glinted the light back at me almost immediately. The creature's cage coming into view. It was torn wide open, long since caked on blood coating every wall and floor. Everything appeared slightly charred, as if set fire to at some point. I swiveled back to Haze to see that she had only moved further into the corner. She continued to shake slightly, entire body quaking like a wet dog. I tried to keep her in my peripheries as I fumbled for an outlet by the desk and tore at the footage, stopping up the projector's spindles. Finally, feeling the cold touch of plastic, I immediately pressed the projector's cord into the port. The ravenous sounds from above screeched hysterically as if being burned, an agony present in Haze's face as her eyes clenched tight in utter terror. Her body continuously pressed into the corner to escape the whirring device now sputtering light against the far wall. More scratched, unwatchable footage played for a few seconds before the reel crackled slightly with a stitched-in cut, again seeming to jump ahead a year or two. My heart immediately rose into my throat as I saw the setup, the bitter taste of bile seeping into my saliva. The same 2 men as before were now completely hairless, small splotches of what looked like radiation poisoning on their faces. They were both rail-thin in appearance, the taller man hunched well beyond half his original height. The dog was now far too big for its cage and had to avoid any movement to not touch the electric bars. It didn't even look as though it could sit down. But far worse than any of that. Worse than the haunting specters that were once so youthful and full of life. Worse than the animal being treated worse than caged livestock. There was now a body bag in the room. A third figure stood over it, far younger looking than the two men, a full beard to contrast their horrendous scarred faces. The material of the body bag was heavy, almost as if lead. The tall man addressed the camera as usual, his eyes no longer looking directly at it. He appeared to be entirely or very nearly blind. His shaking hand slowly held up a clapper that made my skin crawl. In scribbled letters falling below the designated line, the test read, "Human reanimation. Take 1. Thomas slowly brought up a vial of clear liquid in his gloved hands, the camera being taken from its tripod to zoom in on the label. Sticks. Saliva. Was scribbled in red Sharpie, Thomas gesturing to the creature in the cage as he shook the vial, slowly loading a large dose into a syringe. I felt the temperature of the room drop, Haze's form in my peripheries, remaining motionless. The footage jumped around slightly, the body bag being unzipped to reveal the corpse of a young girl. Its hands and feet were tied with zip ties and duct tape, makeup over its dead blue lips making it look more like a disturbing doll than something dead. The minute the lead covering fell away, its human fingers began to twitch, scratching at its own palms like a post-mortem twitch. The dog shuddered in the cage. The third man and Thomas steadily picked the corpse up, seating it awkwardly in a chair. Rigor mortis made the task spine-chillingly difficult. The body was steadily strapped down, the footage skipping ahead a few seconds before again being lost to scratches and grainy static. I rushed my flashlight back over to the cage to see the very same chair, still by the wall. Though it was now rotted and broken, surrounded by a partially melted plexiglass case. I darted the beam back across the room to see Haze, now standing upright in the corner, staring directly at me. She made no movements, not even blinking, like a body that had been propped upright. The only thing to even tell me it wasn't just a plastic figurine was the blood slowly trickling down the gashes in her waxy flesh. The footage sizzled back to life, the corpse now sitting just as rigidly in the chair. The only difference that its eyes were open. The third man was sick in the corner of the room, retching several times until he was dry heaving. The footage jumped ahead, his feet the last thing visible in the frame as he exited. The footage again spliced to a different roll, apparently just catching the tail end of an experiment as a plate of food sat in front of the cadaver. Its eyes stared directly ahead. This time, however, one of its arms had apparently been untied from the chair, gripping a fork with its cold, gray hands. It had decomposed a bit since the last time, noticeably gaunter. Thomas was slowly reaching for the fork in its hand. The food in front of it was untouched. Thomas flinched his hand back several times as if testing the corpse's reaction time. Finally, he He seemed confident enough to rapidly stab forwards and grab the fork. The dead face stretched then, slowly elongating as it turned to face Thomas, rotten gums coming into view as its lips peeled back in a poorly imitated smile, showing every tooth. Its hand was gripped around his own. Then something happened, so fast it didn't even show up in the footage. Thomas just suddenly jerked back in horror, clutching his arm that inexplicably spouted blood. The fork had been forced down the length of his arm, scraping along the bone as it was embedded just beneath his skin. The dead girl's hand reached for him again before he was able to stagger away, the camera shaking as someone rapidly shut it off. The takes came much faster now, as shorter lengths of footage seemed to be spliced together. I looked up from the film to see that Haze had traveled at least half the distance to me, though still standing absolutely still. Her eyes bored directly into mine, even when I looked away. The first shot framed a memory card game being sifted through. Thomas held up 2 cards to the cage with the creature, one red and one black, pointing to the red one but shielding his decision from the corpse's eyes. The tall man then presented the same set of cards to the corpse, assumedly asking it which card had been chosen. It just stared. The second shot just showed a rapid close-up of the decaying girl's eyes. This immediately spliced to the third shot, showing the dead body standing in the center of the room, staring directly at the camera. This shot went on for significantly longer, my hand hesitating towards a fast forward before I noticed a slowly expanding puddle just right of frame. The liquid was dark and sludgy. The frame quickly cut again, the corpse back in the chair now with a plexiglass case over it, as just Thomas held up a series of alphabet charts and sentence diagrams. The tall man never showed up again. I was more focused on the potential fate of the tall man before I fully realized what I was witnessing. My eye swiveled back to Haze to see her again a few steps closer. I slowly moved my hand to the projector, pausing the footage while keeping direct eye contact with her. "You," I spoke over the paused stuttering of the projector, thinking carefully. I stole another glance at the paused frame, the corpse and dog surrounded by several tiny objects. Some squinting confirmed what I had suspected. In conjunction with the alphabet charts and practice sentences, there were several children's books. "Can you?" My stomach slowly ate itself as I looked into Haze's eyes, but only saw the crawling blackness that surrounded the dog. "Can you talk?" Haze remained frozen, eyes showing no signs of recognition. I let the silence drag for a few more seconds before slowly starting up the projector again.